Well, I want to thank Chaim for having me here, and I think looking at most of the other topics, I think I may have been invited for a little comic relief, or at least a little bit.
Very good.
A little bit of lighter humor. So I'm happy to do that. You may remember, or you may not remember, on American television, the AMC hit TV show Mad Men from 2007 to 2014.
Yes, of course.
The Mad Men is not a tribute to the fact that they were very ill-behaved, drinking, womanizing, although they were. It's actually a reference to Madison Avenue, where most of these major agencies were located in New York City. It also is not a reference, I don't think, to the famous Madison Hotel in Naharia. Although you never know, maybe it was prophetic. In any event, I want to talk about this, and from the point of view of the documents, one of the things this TV show did was to accelerate a very egotistical breed. If you went into advertising, you had a pretty healthy ego to begin with. A lot of people publish autobiographies or memoirs. Now I'm not so sure which to call them. But after this show's enormous success, what happened was people started doing podcasts, people started creating websites, and one of the interesting features of this TV show, people started publishing books, what was right and what was wrong about the TV show. It created a whole sub-industry. One of the things that it did is that the obituaries of people who died and who worked in the business, and that includes both my uncle, who was really quite important in this business, and my father, who was less successful, both of them, Olav Shalom. They published much longer obituaries in the New York Times than they probably would have otherwise had it not been for the show. And so I'm speaking about as a son of a madman and the nephew of a madman, and the talk divides into two parts. I'm going to talk a little bit about the cohort aspect of who actually went into this business, which I think has been largely neglected, and then I'm going to talk about some of the famous campaigns that they ran. Specifically, Levy's Real Jewish Rye Bread, El Al, and a Volkswagen. Okay, so that's what I'm going to talk. And we can decide whether these are ego documents or not afterwards, after the talk. Okay, so again, this is just a little bit of an outline of where I'm going to go with this. I want to talk about the formation of white ethnic identity, and we'll start with a couple of white people. We'll have a lot of white people here at the beginning. These advertising obviously is very old in America. It started already in the 18th century and in the 19th century. These are masters of the old school. Rosser Reeves, who founded something called Ted Bates, still a very, very large agency. I think it's still the largest, and David Ogilvy. David Ogilvy on the right coined something called the unique selling proposition. In other words, until around 1950, the way that advertising worked is you located something that was unique to the product, and then you just repeated it in, more or less ad infinitum until you ran out of your time slot. It was very uncreative, it was very hard sell, and it really had very little wit or humor about it. And what changed in the 1960s, or really in the 1950s, was the emergence of a new advertising agencies. Sometimes it's called the creative revolution. Again, these people had very large egos, so to call a creative revolution for something that's basically still selling products, I'm not sure if that's justified, but that's what they called it. These guys are, again, three more white people, so it looks the same, but it really isn't. So this person on the left is named Ned Doyle. He was an Irish American. He was a ex-Marine. We'll get back to this. A lot of these guys were in the were in the armed services. The one in the middle is an honest to God, what we call in America a WASP, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, but he was sufficiently aggravating to the Republican administration of the time that he made it to Nixon's enemies list, which is really quite an accomplishment. And the one on the right, who we'll focus on a little bit more than the others, was a guy named Bill Bernbach, who was the head of the creative department. And we're going to mainly be speaking about the creative side of the industry. There, of course, there are various salesmen and so forth. Here, this is just a chart I made of as many people I could locate as possible. Okay. So, again, what was unique about this agency, Doyle Dane Bernbach, which spawned a whole lot of agencies, was the idea that advertising should be clever, it should be witty. There were some technical things that Bernbach did that were really quite innovative. He put art directors and copywriters in the same room, and he made it used to be done in like assembly line fashion. You would have the copy, then you'd send it to the art director, then it would be sold by the sales agent. And what Bernbach did was to say, no, we're going to have it all together. But the real innovation was less, although that was pretty innovative, but the greatest innovation was in the style. And I would argue one of the greatest innovations that has not gotten quite as much attention as I think it ought to have is the kinds of people that Doyle Dane Bernbach were willing to hire. Up until now, all of the major agencies, they wouldn't probably be known to you, so I won't bother you with them, but they basically like to hire people from the Ivy League schools or from very elite private schools in the Northeast. All of a sudden, Doyle Dane and Bernbach started to hire people who were Jewish, second generation Jewish, second generation Italian, second generation Irish, some expatriates who came over to America because they didn't like the old country, a couple of people who were in Japanese internment camps during World War II. And so we had really kind of a revolution of who made up these agencies. And it would have been very well known to most of these advertising people that they never would have gotten a job at J. Walter Thompson or Ted Bates because they weren't the right sort. And so there was a white ethnic expansion of the entire industry. And I'll get into a little more about why that matters. So really, when we're talking about the Jewish, I don't really mean just Jewish. I mean Jewish among other white ethnics.
Non-Protestant.
What?
Non-Protestant.
Not non-Protestant, yeah. Principally non-Protestant, that's right. I hadn't thought of it that way, but right. Irish, Italian, Japanese, and African American. So fewer African Americans, to be sure, but certainly a pretty. And so again, I've already described the nature of this group, and this is a chart I just downloaded and then filled in what I knew from memory and from a bunch of interviews that I conducted about 5 or 6 years ago. I still haven't written this up into an article. Maybe I will now after this conference. And I want to say a few things about this group, because they were really kind of a cohort, other than the fact that they worked on the same building in Madison Avenue. I want to emphasize that what is called a creative revolution, and it's called this in the literature without really delving into it, I think, it's really a New York phenomenon, not only in the sense that it drew people from all over England and other places in America to New York, because that's where the innovative agencies were. But I mean it in another sense, it's mainly a New York phenomenon because almost all of the people who worked in these agencies, beginning with Doyle Dane Bernbach, were New Yorkers. They didn't necessarily, when I say New Yorkers, I really mean they grew up in areas of secondary migration. In other words, these aren't people who are immigrants from the Lower East Side. They wouldn't have had the ability culturally to write ads and to do the technical photography necessary. They were the children of those people. And so they grew up generally in second areas of settlement in New York, which is to say the Bronx, Brooklyn, Harlem, which actually we associate with black culture, but is really in the first couple of decades of the 20th century was a major area of Jewish culture. They were generally lower middle class. They were mainly apartment dwellers, and the rare occasions, like Julian Koenig, who coined the phrase Earth Day, and whose daughter is a very well-known reporter on National Public Radio, and Phyllis Robinson, who was the first woman to head the creative department at any agency. They were a little bit better off. They were wealthy, but they weren't from the Lower East Side. They were from the Upper East Side of New York, really a pretty Tony area. So let me see if I can go back just a second without messing it up. I can. Good. Just to emphasize, and I should have said it right off the bat, this is Phyllis Robinson, the first female head of the creative department at Doyle Dane, which she was for quite a long time. And to the left is Judy Protas, who we'll come back to in a few minutes. Judy, and some of these people I remember firsthand, some from my father's and uncle's recollections. Judy is credited with having coined the "you don't need to be Jewish to love Levy's" rye bread, real Jewish rye bread. So these are major hitters. The fellow with a pink halo, he gave himself a pink halo. He downloaded, he created a website all about himself. Again, these guys have very healthy egos in that sense. Len Sirowitz, and in the back is my Uncle Bob. They were among the first of the creative teams. So, so we've talked about their background, we've talked about where they grew up. The one thing I also want to emphasize is what else that made these guys really, I would say, a cohort is the general background that they shared. They shared a lot of things in common. Almost all of these people went to what were and still are called magnet schools in New York City. In America, in the big cities, this is still common, you have to take an exam to get into a lot of these schools. Bronx High School of Science, Stuyvesant High School, School of Art and Design. These are very, very competitive schools, and they, it's absurd if I got into other fields other than advertising, how many Nobel Prizes and how many heads of departments and various medical and legal firms came out of these magnet schools. Most of the people who worked at Doyle Dane and Bernbach, and you'll see on the chart that I sent around, most of them came out of these magnet schools. Then they went, because of economics principally, and also because they were damn good schools, they went to New York City schools. CCNY, City College of New York, had something like 2/3 to 3/4 of the enrollment was Jewish students. NYU was a little bit less, and it was just a little bit tonier. Nowadays, NYU is phenomenally expensive to go to. But in those days, it was CCNY, City College of New York, was free. NYU was maybe a couple $100 for the year. And you could still afford, if you were beginning to do a little bit better, to send your kids there. That wasn't 60 or 70% Jewish, but it was a pretty healthy 30 or 40% Jewish. A lot of these Jewish madmen never lived anywhere but New York. In other words, this is true not only growing up, but it actually turns out to be true for their whole lives. Many of them never lived anywhere else. That would include my father, my uncle, but it would include many other people I knew growing up in the 60s and 70s. Many had never left the United States before military service. And there was an interesting, masculine pecking order. I found this out a lot of this was very amusing. I'm really sorry I can't show you the clip, but okay, I'll describe it for you. I'll act it out for you. I found this pecking order thing out when I interviewed a guy named Dan Marino, who worked for Doyle Dane Bernbach, and this is probably 6-7 years ago. And I said, "So you were in the Army too?" And he almost bit my head off. He said, "I was in the effing Marines." And so there was just I've been in Israel, I think you can relate to this a lot. It's the difference between, Chayal Regel and, San Chanim. It's like, no, it really mattered to these guys what branch of the service they were in. It mattered whether they had served in wartime or not. It mattered what their rank was. But all of these things, I could take every Italian, Irishman, and Jew who worked at Doyle Dane Bernbach, and every single one of them pretty much would have fit almost all of these items. So we're talking about a really interesting cohort of people. And so when we talk about even to the level of family, or even where they lived after they made a little money, and what happened with their families, it's extraordinary how often. So Bill Bernbach was ahead of his time in terms of marital relations. He married non-Jewish right out of the bat. He married an Italian girl named Evelyn Carbone. They worked at Shenley's Liquor Distributors. He ran the mailroom, so he had no, he could make contact with whomever he wanted. His parents sat Shiva. They were still fairly traditional family living in the Bronx. He didn't care. But many of the other madmen first married someone from their own ethnic group, then they divorced. And by the way, this was at a time when in the 60s and the 70s, American Jewry, the intermarriage or exogamy rate was only around 10%. So these guys were really ahead of the curves. Now it's 52%. So today it wouldn't be extraordinary noteworthy, but it was for those years. They married second time around, but it would be a mistake to think they married Nancy from Kansas. Who they married the second time around were other white ethnics who were Italian or Irish or Japanese, or in my uncle's case, his second wife was Lebanese, and she had come to America. So it was very interesting, even if you go down to the family level, these people were not just a cross-section of America who made the creative revolution. They were very much a New York ethnic group of people. And there are a variety of reasons. I won't get into that too much. I will say one last thing about them. They were, and again, it looks like I'm not going to be able to show you these clips. I'll just describe them briefly. Darn it. Well, hold on. It's circling for a second. Well, if it decides to... no, it's not going to...
No, it is.
It is, really?
Yeah.
Oh, I'll be darned. How great. Okay, so they were also, one other factor, they were extremely politically liberal. Okay, there were no conservatives in these offices, and one of them, Julian Koenig, was hired. Doyle Dane Bernbach was hired to do a presidential ad against Barry Goldwater in the 1964 presidential campaign against Lyndon Johnson. And this ad is so famous, it's considered to be one of the first attack ads. Okay, so now I'm going to go into 3 quick campaigns, one for rye bread, one for Volkswagen, and one for El Al. The first one I'll be quick about. There was a bakery called Levy's Bakery. Whitey Rubin was its manager. They were about to go bankrupt. They couldn't compete with store-bought white Wonder Bread, that spongy stuff that you've all seen. And they couldn't compete with real rye bread made in a local bakery, which in the 1950s and the 1960s was still how New Yorkers bought bread. And so there was a problem, and they went to Bill Bernbach and his creative team. They said, what are we going to do? He said, we're going to rebrand it Levy's Real Jewish Rye Bread. And Whitey Rubin, this is... As you remember, the 1930s, 1940s were a time of extraordinary anti-Semitism in America. He said, we don't want to call attention to ourselves that way. And Bill Bernbach is supposed to have replied, why should we put Jewish in it? Bill Bernbach, for God's sakes, your name is Levy's. They're not going to mistake you for Episcopalian. So with a very small advertising budget, they changed the name. And then they changed the advertising from Jewish newspapers, because they said no Jew's going to eat your rye bread. They changed it to the general press, and it worked. And then they started a campaign, a very famous campaign, with a whole variety of ethnic types, a black choir boy, just a Native American railroad worker. And this is my personal favorite, an Irish policeman. This is my personal favorite because Irish-Jewish relations in New York were very, very rough. And there was a lot of Irish hooliganism in Irish-Jewish relations. And so this is a very positive, very positive, optimistic American post-World War II kind of expression in my view, right? We beat the Nazis and now we're going to overcome our own differences because we're all American. And this was just a hugely successful campaign. That's a picture of Phyllis Robinson, and that's one of their many great slogans. New York is eating it up. Levy's real Jewish rye bread. And this became a big hit, not only in New York, but in Minneapolis, Detroit. It actually turned Levy's real Jewish rye bread into a national brand. Fantastic. So, okay. The next one I'm going to do, and I'll do it briefly again, is Volkswagen. Volkswagen is consistently ranked the best all-time campaign in the history of advertising. I don't really care about that, but I'll just tell you because it's relevant. This was at the Detroit heyday. Cars were huge. They were gas guzzlers. They were totally, they were monsters on the road. And here's this little Beetle. It's short. It's air-cooled, which nobody understood. It had a rear engine, and it looked funny, right? And above that, it had one other very obvious problem. As a Volkswagen, it was, a car actually supported by the Nazi regime quite directly. And so George Lois, who was Greek, not Jewish, but a New Yorker, said, we have a problem. We have to sell a Nazi car in a Jewish town. Which I think was, I don't care if he really said it. Here's one of about 100 fantastic advertisements. This is one of the breakthrough ones, though. The caption is, think small. And this was totally contrary to the unique selling proposition of the previous decades. Think small. The Volkswagen, very tiny, mainly white on the picture, and clearly off-center, right? And that was all very, very deliberate. Ironically, the art director for this was a second-generation German-American who grew up in Yorkville, which was in Upper East Side. I'll show you one more, and then this is another piece of, I would say, American patriotism masquerading as selling you a product, or selling you a product masquerading as American patriotism. This is 1969, right after the first moon landing, and here is a picture of the lunar module, in case you're too young to remember what that looks like, and the caption, written by my father, by the way, it's ugly, but it gets you there. You'll notice the VW was not shown in this ad at all. This was a short, just VW, and then this is a TV spot, and it was like, it was a little bit witty, and again, very patriotic, very post-World War II era of American confidence, and again, created by a Jewish copywriter, in this case my father, and an Italian art director. That was the absolute normal ethnic breakdown of these selling groups. A Jewish copywriter, an Italian art director, and an Irish salesman who would go out, I forget what they called them, account executives who would go out and sell it. Okay, I'm getting close. Chaim, can I go 2 or 3 minutes over?
Sure.
Okay. I think you'll find this funny. I hope you will. This is actually that earlier picture I showed you of the guy with the pink halo, Len Sirowitz. He's up now 25 years later talking. And the fellow you'll see at the end in the back is my uncle shortly before he passed away. And he is recounting when they went to Wolfsburg in Germany for one of their early attempts to deal with bringing the Volkswagen to America. I think you'll find this funny. I hope so.
There are 1,000 stories. It's hard to pick one, but there's one that I'll never forget. It happened in the early 1960s when I was informed by Bill Burback that I would be the first art director to succeed Helmut Krohn on Volkswagen account, which was scary as hell to begin with. What an act to follow. But the thing that made it exciting for me was to work with my friend Bob Levenson. And that was wonderful. And the story takes place at that time, 1961, 62, and we were on our first, or my first orientation trip to the Volkswagen factory in Wolfsburg, Germany. And we were over there meeting with the executives. Now you have to realize that in the scheme of things, that's not much long after the Second World War. And we were there to meet the German executives. Here we were, two Jewish boys from New York. And the other side of the room was the executives who we were certain spent some time in the German army. And I remember we went out to dinner one night. We went to the next town of Braunschweig in a restaurant called the Gewandhaus. And there we were, just like I'm sitting next to Bob here, Bob and I sitting on one side of the room, and the German executives slash ex-army officers sitting on the other side of the room, and we were drinking away, and the guy on the other side of the table starts lamenting the fact that what a sad state, economic state Germany was in today. He kept saying, if we hadn't lost the two wars, we would have been better off. And Bob and I we look at each other, and Bob was turning redder and redder. And Bob turns to the guy and says, yeah, you lost two in a row. The tension mounted. Fortunately, that guy's boss put his arm around the guy, and he said, Hans, I think you just lost the third.
Okay. Maybe you find that funny. I hope you do. I will just conclude with saying a couple of things about El Al, the campaign for El Al. It really is, in the case of El Al, much more so than VW or even Levy's, because it was 10 years later, there was a great invitation to lean into the ethnicity angle, and they did. There was a built-in customer base. In my uncle's book, Bill Birnbach, he said it was like helping Israel. I don't think it helped all that much to advertise for El Al, but certainly that's what the American Jewish people in DDB thought. El Al had a jet-propelled planes that could fly direct from New York to Tel Aviv without landing in Goose Bay or Gander, now Newfoundland. And so one of their first slogans was "No goose, no gander," with a picture of an ocean torn like a scroll. It was the first of many, many clever taglines, often playing on this Jewish identity. We've been in the travel business a long time, with a picture of Noah's Ark. My son the pilot, a play on my son the doctor, and we don't take off until everything is kosher. That's clearly they weren't referring to the food, although that too. And so basically, I'll just show you one last one. This is another one of my father's. A little bit of antiquated Hebrew, and so it says the most important Hebrew words you'll ever learn, and then right, today we'd say Sherutim, and then I know that, and then underneath is my father's typical tongue-in-cheek language, when you gotta go, you gotta go. And then he goes on and explains, you know, basically it's a plea to American Jews to go fly and visit Israel, and it's not dangerous, it's not, everyone speaks English, you'll get along well, you should go and you should take El Al. And it was very interesting, you know. Okay, so here we have these three campaigns, all of which are, I would say, they were all three very effective campaigns. There's no question about that. That's not arguable. I would say it's also pretty clear they were inside jokes among white ethnics living in New York City in the 1960s, late 50s, 60s, and 70s. And it's not surprising, given what we know about this group as a cohort, that they all could share on this joke, right? Because they all came from the same places. And if it were, you know, it's just like if I were to take an Italian example, you know, there was, I don't even know what Alka-Seltzer is. It's like, it's in case you have indigestion, plop, flop, fizz, fizz, or what a relief it is. And they go, oh, that, that was a spicy meatball with an Italian accent. It's like the Jewish guys got those jokes just as well as the Italian guys got these jokes. It's basically the same upbringing. Finally, I'll conclude, lest you think this is totally an ego document of my own, and it may be, because I'm getting to talk about my uncle and my father's work, but I do think there's some actual academic lessons to be derived from this. First of all, it's just a way of examining white ethnicity formation in the second generation. We talk a lot about the immigrant generation in Jewish history, American Jewish history. Very often, I think the second generation gets dropped. We're also talking about a new industry formation. In other words, when you talk about Tin Pan Alley or Hollywood, you would never not talk about the Jewish angle. You couldn't avoid it. Well, you could, but it would be weird. In the case of advertising, it's not talked about as much, but it should be. DDB in 1949, when it was founded, was worth zero. When it was merged and lost its identity in 1986, it was worth $1.2 billion. That's the creation of a significant industry, especially if you take a look at all the DDB alumni who formed their own successful agencies, many of whom did. And I would just say what the garment industry was to the immigrant generation of Jews and Italians too, by the way. American Jewish historians need to investigate the role of ethnicity in the second generation businesses to which Jews were drawn. Second generation Jews didn't become farmers. They didn't become roofers. They became teachers or went into liquor sales or into cosmetics or, in this case, into advertising. So the second generation didn't lose its economic specificity. It still was Jews and Italians and other white ethnics who were not Protestant, who were not white Anglo Protestants. They didn't just spread out randomly. They spread out into fields where there was more openness to them. And finally, and this is the last point I'll make, is that often the persistence of Jewish liberalism in America, I think, is handled at too abstract a level. People say, why is it that Jews are still voting Democratic when in 2016, when Donald Trump is so pro-Israel, but Jews don't vote for him? Why did Jews vote for Barack Obama? I think it was 78%, even though, there's a lot of things about Barack Obama that maybe Jews would have found problematic. The answer is Jews continue to be super liberal in America on the whole, and that's too often explained at 30,000 feet. In other words, they have an interest in a multicultural America. Of course that's true. But I would say one needs to also explain it at this level. In other words, their parents, their grandparents worked and lived and socialized with other people who had similar political views. They went into industries where these were the dominant views, and they lived their lives in places like New York where these were the dominant views. And so this is, I think, one of the areas of explaining American Jewish liberalism that I think the boat has been missed, and I think deserves more attention. Okay, I'm sure you know I could go on, but I won't. Thank you.
You just as my narration, you mentioned the end of the lecture, the issue of the second generation as a topic regarding American economy and the success of the Jews in that. And I was just wondering to myself if this is indeed the issue, or is it the main issue? Is it not also correct to say that we are speaking about the post-Second World War issue, or in Jewish terms, post-Holocaust issue? I mean, those things are intertwined. You
You
cannot
bet.
differentiate between, it's not just a matter of immigration and settlement and things like that, but that the other issues involved in it.
Couldn't agree with you more. Absolutely. I think this is an expression of what R.A. Gorin called the golden age of American Jewry from 1945 to 1955. I think it actually extends maybe 5 or 10 years longer than that, but that's quibbling.
It's more than this.
Yeah, I think more than this.
Until 68.
Yeah, maybe.
The beginning of the
Yeah,
wave of
yeah,
the
right.
wars at university, etc., etc. I think
Right.
until 1968.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe.
goes on.
I'm not sure. I haven't thought about the chronology, but there's no question you're correct that this is also part of it. And again, if you look into the details of the copy, you'll see this enormous optimism, enormous patriotism, enormous confidence. The Jewish, and add like Levy's Real Jewish Rye Bread, or we don't take off until it's kosher, or the Hebrew National hot dogs, we answer to a higher authority. That wasn't done by Doyle Dane Bernbach, but it's a great ad. It's a great ad. American Jews never would have had the confidence to do advertisements like that in the era of the 30s or the 40s, the era of Father Coughlin, and era of Henry Ford, and the era of Charles Lindbergh. This is very much, I couldn't agree with you more, very much a post-World War II phenomenon. And, very recently, some very important intellectual figures have said, you know what? Unfortunately, this may have been a blip in American Jewish history. And we're reverting to a less friendly, more hostile environment. And that's not original to me, but I must say I tend to agree with that verdict. So I agree with you. Please.
But it's interesting that this is sort of like a parallel to Hollywood, obviously less known, but it was a big boost also for big business.
You bet.
And I think, though, I don't think we have exactly defined what all this is, but I would say that, let's say in this period of the post, where the Jews and other ethnicities overcame WASPism,
Yes.
okay, that they have a certain ethnic sophistication and a certain savviness, much more out of proportion than the rest of the population. And it is unusual because it's probably going to tip, okay? Now the Jews cannot go to Ivy League colleges as much, and that the Jews don't serve in the military anymore, really, okay? So they're not,
Right.
okay, they're still on top of it in a lot of ways, whether it was Zuckerberg or
Yeah.
it's not a fluke.
No.
Okay, but so it's interesting that you're pointing to creative. This was a niche.
Yes.
And the parallel which I noticed, I went in Southern American Jewish studies. There's the whole phenomenon of Nashville, and who made Nashville? Jewish guys who never saw the South at all in office buildings in New York City. It's the same sophistication and creativity. They didn't know anything about the South. These guys too, they're kind of flippant, right?
Yeah.
They are savvy. They know they're not, there's no depth there like there is in this room, but they definitely outsmart most of the society, and it's impressive.
Yeah.
The Madison Avenue salve
Yeah.
is very impressive.
I certainly agree. I think you made at least 2 points I'd like to comment on. The first one is I couldn't agree more that they introduced a new style of wit, self-deprecating wit, a sort of wordplay, word cleverness, and they talk about it a lot in their memoirs and advertising, internal, stuff, and it's a lot of what we associate with Jewish humor. I find it often to be exceedingly subjective, and therefore I don't like to get into that's so Jewish, that's not Jewish. That's a very, those of you may know, most of you are not old enough, but those of you may have heard of the Lenny Bruce routine, Jewish and Goyish. That is so not funny anymore. But in the 1950s and the 1960s, it was funny. And so there's absolutely that kind of New York sensibility. That's, I would say, more New York than Jewish even, that was widely shared and that succeeded very well in the heartland, for sure. Couldn't agree more. As far as your other point, with the building of like Nashville or Las Vegas for that matter, the outsized contributions of Jews, I would say there is always, because of the immigrant story and the diaspora story of Jews, there is often a strong economic element to the tale that shouldn't. There was a period when we as Jewish historians, or historians who are Jewish, or either both, were embarrassed to talk about. But we shouldn't be. It's just part of the historical record, like anything else. In other words, if you go to the South, since you mentioned the Southern Jewish Historical Association, even more than Nashville, to me, what is, or just as much, let's say, as illustrative of the Jewish role is what is called the Jew store. That's what it was called, the Jew store. There, peddlers who came over, and then they didn't need to go peddling anymore. Then they had enough capital to settle down. Then they opened little stores throughout the South, and they lasted a pretty long time. They're not really, on the whole, there anymore, but they lasted a while. And some of them, of course, also migrated to New York and other big cities and founded what became the large department stores in New York. So I don't think that's anything. If economic history is what you're interested in, I think that's when you should pursue it. So, yeah.
I think that maybe a bit different angle is look at the Jewish comedians first on TV and then on the movies. And you could see a distinct Jewish humor.
Yeah.
I remember,
Yeah.
people don't notice, if you look on the Frisco Kid, you could see Harrison Ford and Jane Wilder and the other
Great movie.
getting out of the storm, and one talks to each other, say, Meshugene. He said, no, Meshugene. And you see the difference between the Litvak and the Galician.
Yeah.
In an American movie.
In an American
And if
Frisco
you're not
Kid.
Jewish, you don't understand the difference between the Litvak and the Galician. So
Right.
it's amazing. It got into the deepest part of American show business.
Yeah.
Not to speak on Jackie Mason and then accent and others,
Yeah.
which is
It's
brutality.
Yeah.
It's, but I'm talking about, you don't associate Gene Wilder with subtlety, but you find it.
Yeah.
And this is amazing. And
I-
of course, the early jokes of Woody Allen later, which
Yeah. Well, I know. I mean, again, how much of this falls into the category of ego documents, I'm not really sure. I think actually some of the obituaries, interestingly enough,
Yeah,
are ego documents,
Yeah.
because I think in many cases they half wrote them themselves, before they left. But I will say, just if you, other than your show of shows, which was Sid Caesar and Imogen Coca, who's not Jewish, but all of the writers' room, full of Jewish writers who later became very famous, like Mel Brooks and Woody Allen. But I'll say one last thing about that, is that the opposite of Lenny Bruce, who was quite outrageous in his day and cutting edge and came to a very bad end, at the other end was my uncle, Sam Levenson, who became a very, very popular humorist. That's what they called comedians who weren't that funny. And he was
the guy who wrote the book, he's your uncle.
Yes.
He would write the books about American Jewish humor, too.
Yes.
Ah.
Yeah, Everything But Money,
Yeah.
Meet the Folks. Yeah, that's my uncle, long gone. And he was on, Hollywood Stars and all these like kitschy shows from the 50s and 60s. So, yeah, humor is yet another place where there was, but again, there was an opening, right?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.